Good to see everybody here this morning. I'm happy to have you for class here. We'll continue our study today in the survey of the Old Testament. Today is going to be a bit of a test because I'm not exactly sure how we're going to get through the Old Testament in the time I've been allotted to cover it. But we'll see how progress goes today. But I may alter. I feel like I got an echo. Do I have an echo, or is it just me? Yeah. We'll see how the class goes today, and then I may alter how I approach the class after today, but we'll see. I'm going to try to get through the book of Genesis today, and we'll see if we can accomplish that. Before we start our class, let's have a word of prayer. Father, we're thankful for this day, the privilege that we have to spend time in study of your word. We're thankful that you've left that for our understanding and for the comfort that it gives us in our study, to be with all those that are teaching classes this morning. We pray, Father, that you'll be with this world in this time of conflict. We pray that peace might come. We ask, Father, also that you be with those of our members and families of our members who are sick and battling difficult diseases, and pray that you'll watch over them and those that are caring for them. We ask that you go with us this morning through our studies and give us strength to serve you more faithfully. In Christ's name, amen. So we had the introduction last week and talked a little bit about how we're going to try to approach this, and so I'm making that first effort today. But let me see. Okay, this is the way we concluded last week. So the first focus is going to be to cover the books of the law. I hope to do that in 2 weeks or 3 weeks at the most, and so that we can get through this part. Part of that is because Genesis is a book that everybody's familiar with. So I'm not going to go through all the stories, but I'm going to try to point out some things through history to help you understand that. But before I do that, I wanted to give you this to me is the framework of the Old Testament. And I'm going to ask you to not get bogged down by the dates. If you Google or you read various books, you'll get different dates here. But these are the dates that kind of work for me in terms of understanding history. When you get down to the period of Judges, it becomes more clear that the dates are more accurate, but some people would put this as much as 200 years later than I have done, but I believe this is a more accurate assessment. The books of the law really are creation through Egyptian bondage and the Israelites in bondage and the wandering in the wilderness, and those are the things that we're going to be covering in the books of law. And then the conquest of the Promised Land, which occurs in the book of Joshua, somewhere around 1406 BC. And then we'll go into the period of Judges. It's kind of interesting to me that there's a 300-plus year amount of history that's covered in one book in the Bible. Well, one and part of another book, part of 1 Samuel and in the book of Judges. Tumultuous time for Israel. There was a united Israel where it became kings. There were 3 kings in the united Israel. Saul being the first king, David being the second, and Solomon being the third. All 3 ruled for 40 years, although David really ruled part of the kingdom for 7 years, and then the full kingdom for 33 years. It's pretty clear that that's the amount of time. When you get down to these dates, there's a lot of secular history that would point out that these are accurate dates. So I feel quite confident within a year or two when you get down to the United Kingdom and going forward where Old Testament history occurs. The kingdom's divided, and the division of the kingdom between a northern tribe or northern kingdom and southern kingdom, however you want to call it, the northern kingdom was then named Israel. This is after Solomon's time. Because of Solomon's unfaithfulness, the Lord said he's going to rip the kingdom away from him, but because of his commitment to Abraham, his commitment to David, that through that commitment, then he's going to leave a portion, which is Judah. Judah and Benjamin are actually 2 tribes. We're part of the southern, but it's always referred to as Judah. And there's a whole history as to why that occurs, which we will not go into, but something you could look at some point. The divided kingdom, the northern kingdom, was conquered by Assyria in 721 BC. Some would say 722 BC, but a lot of history would point to 721 BC. And then the divided kingdom, Judah, was conquered and taken over by the Babylonians Beginning in 606 BC, it actually occurred during three levels: 606 BC, 596 BC, and 586 BC. We'll cover those more when we get to that part of the study. But what I'm really telling you here, when I give you this timeline, what I'm really giving you is the Old Testament books. So when you think about it, Genesis, the first book, Exodus, the second book, Leviticus, is a book of laws, and we'll get to this in just a second. Deuteronomy and Numbers are really the wandering. The conquest of the Promised Land is Joshua. The period of Judges is Judges. A united Israel is 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, including the divided kingdom. So that part of history is really, I've just given you through what the Old Testament books are, and this is what's occurring during that time. Babylonia overtakes Assyria and Egypt at the Battle of Carchemish in 606 BC under later Nebuchadnezzar. So you can see we're about to move into a whole second category of the books. So that occurs. Judah's in Babylonian captivity. That's where Ezekiel and Daniel prophesied, was during that time. So the books, when you think about that. When Persia overtakes Babylon in 539 BC, when Cyrus takes over and he frees the Jews to go back, the remnant of the Jews to go back to Jerusalem, and then they return to rebuild the temple. That was led by Zerubbabel, who is important because he's in Christ's lineages. There was a second return led by Ezra, the priest, who brought back worship. And then the last was Nehemiah to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem in 445 BC. And that period of time is the last event we have. That's Babylon captivity, so you can already figure out that's Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. So those are the books. If you go through the rest of the books, the prophets, they all prophesied mostly during the time of the kings, predominantly during the time of the kings, but not exclusively during the time of the kings, but predominantly during the time of the kings. The last prophecy was, some say 430 BC, some say 400 BC, and that's the book of Malachi. So really, if you look at this history right here, all the books of the Bible, with one exception, fit into all this history. All the books of the Old Testament, fit into this history with one exception. The one exception is Job, and it's not quite clear when Job was written. May very well have been one of the earlier books, because it certainly appears to be during the patriarchal age, when God dealt directly with the fathers of the house, so dealt directly with Job. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. I don't give you this to make you an expert, but if you think about a survey of the Old Testament, I don't know how you think about a survey of the Old Testament without thinking about this timeline, because this actually covers all the books in the Old Testament that we're going to be covering. So I don't know if you have any questions or observations about that. As we go through these, I'll point these out again as to what part of this timeline we're fitting in with our study, and then I can give you some actually secular history that would support this as well, that shows it's true what occurred. But this would be the survey of the occurrence. So we're going to be covering the books of the law. We'll begin with Genesis today. The second book is Exodus, of course, and it's the introduction to Moses and the departure from Egyptian bondage. So that's Moses as a central character. Moses is probably the author of all these books. I think the back part of Deuteronomy was probably written by Joshua, but generally Moses is attributed to this. The book of Genesis is probably written during the wandering in the wilderness, as be the thought time frame, because God, of course, was giving Moses that information during that time. Leviticus is really the laws and regulations of the Levites and the priests. That's kind of what that book is, which is probably the least read book of this group of 5 books. And we'll point out some things about that are important. The book of Numbers is really the numbering of the Israelites, and it's called the book of Numbers. I think the numbering actually occurred in only 3 chapters, the first 3 chapters. Most of it is their wandering in the wilderness, and then their view of the promised land. That's the book where the spies are talked about that were sent into the promised land. Deuteronomy, I probably unfairly characterized the book, but I've just said it's what happened in the 40th year in the wilderness. Because what really Deuteronomy is about is the preparation for going into the promised land. That's when Joshua is chosen to be the next leader. It's when Moses talks to Joshua, Joshua talks to the people talk to Joshua, the people talk to God, Joshua talks to God. And that's just at the end of Deuteronomy. So I think when you think about Deuteronomy, there's some repeats of laws and legislations. There's some repeat of that. But it's mostly thinking about the encouragement of the Israelites to get ready to take the promised land. If you go all the way back to the beginning of Deuteronomy, he says, then you should tell your children and your children's children about what occurred. And you're all familiar with the verses that say, when do you talk to them about it? When do you talk to your children about what occurred? When they're all the time. When they're sitting down, when they're rising up, when they wake up. There's a pattern there. And you say, well, so we use those verses, and I use those verses today to talk about our obligation that we have to teach our youth. And there is an obligation that we have to teach our children and our children's children. That is an obligation that we have. But when you put it in the context of this, what he's doing, he said, don't let the next generation forget what God did for this generation. When you get to that promised land, don't let the people forget. And that makes complete sense when we get to Judges and we find out that they did. So that's why I say this is really preparing for the promised land, for taking the promised land. Now I said earlier, that's a pretty small capsule of what Deuteronomy's, of all the messages that are in Deuteronomy, but you need to think about it in that context. So that's the book of the laws. And with that, let's go to the book of Genesis. I'm going to try to actually walk us through the book. And so we're not going to do this in every verse, but I'm going to try to point out some verses in each segment that we're going to be looking at here. But I'm not going to give the amount of attention that you might like to have to some of these things. But let's just start. We all know that Genesis 1 and 2 is about the creation of the universe and the creation of man. We find out in verse 27 of chapter 1 that God created man in his own image, male and female. We can find out at the end of that God saw that everything that he made, and behold, this is verse 31, it was what? God's creation was what? How did he view it? Good. He viewed it as good. What did man do with what God created as good? We fell away. Man fell away. But we need to understand, and there's a lot you can talk about the creation. I'm not going to get into days and discussions about that. There's a lot that we could cover there. What I want us to just take away from that is that God created the universe. He created man after his own image. And when he got through and he rested on the day of the seventh day, it was good. He looked back and said, what I've done is good. He had prepared for everything. He prepared for everything. Even just think about in verse 6 of chapter 2, there's a mist from the earth that watered the whole face of the ground. So people say, how did it get watered? Well, that's how it got watered. There was a mist. There's a debate about whether there was rain before the flood. I don't know if there's rain before the flood or not, but what I know is that God provided a mist to actually provide nourishment to the plants, and that's occurred because he says it occurred. And he said it was all over. So that's that. There was one tree in the garden, well, the two trees that are talked about, the tree of life and tree of knowledge of good and evil, and what they could eat of everything. They could have everything in the garden but one thing. What was the one thing they couldn't do? They couldn't eat of the knowledge of good, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Only one thing they had to do. And what did they do? Ate of it, right? Ate of it. I don't know. There's a lot of questions you can talk about. This is at the end of chapter 2, I guess the end of chapter 2 where Eve was made. And in chapter 3, the Satan comes and appears to Eve. And in reading this, and this is when I realized I was about to dive too deep for a class like this. There was a debate in a book that I was reading about why he approached Eve and not approached Adam, and I realized that was a worthless study. But yes, Richard.
Isn't that what people do today? What they're not supposed to do? They go ahead and do it.
Yeah, there's something. I love and I started to bring this verse up, but I'm not going to bring it up. People do that today, is what Richard said. Yeah, there's this sentiment today. People only want what they can't have, right? That's the way people are. If you can't have it, then you want it. And that's why the sins are talked about in the New Testament. Just 3 simple things: pride of life, lust of flesh, lust of the eyes. See something that you can't have and you want it. That's what it is, and that's what occurred here. So they ate of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and that sin entered the world. And then sin further entered the world then in chapter 4 when Cain murdered Abel, his brother. So then we get to chapter 5 of the book of Genesis. And chapter 5 of the book of Genesis was interesting because it's important historically. It's actually nothing but generations. So it's a book that you can read through and read through it quickly, and you go through it and there's names you can't pronounce. There's some important lessons in there, like Enoch, who didn't die but walked with God, and we could talk about all that. Methuselah, who is the longest living man according to recorded history here, 969 years old. And he was the grandfather of Noah. So I don't know if you maybe picked that up in reading that. But that book of generations is important because it's tracing Adam down through Noah. So it comes to Adam's 3rd son that we read about, Seth, which is important because that's the lineage of Christ. So other than that, there's really not much to take away from that. And then we have a flood. So I find chapter 6... sometimes difficult for me to read. Verse 5 and verse 6, God saw the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every imagination or thoughts of his heart was only evil. So man at this point had turned to be nothing but evil. God said every thought, and it repented the Lord that he had made man on earth, and it grieved him at his heart. And I just think about that. These generations that we've seen, where we've gone from the Garden of Eden to this point in time, God was saddened. He regretted. He said, repented. He regretted having created man at that point. It grieved him. And you think about that. With one exception, Noah found grace in the eyes of God in verse 8. So we've gotten to a point where the world has gotten so bad, it's so sinful, that God regretted even having created being. We look at the New Testament sometimes, we say God is long-suffering, and we think about it within one generation. You know, God is long-suffering in my life, and He is. He's long-suffering. God is really long-suffering when He saw everybody He created except apparently 8 people fall away. Yet He didn't destroy man, but He did destroy those that had fallen away. And that's the purpose of the flood. I think about the flood a little differently after studying this a number of times. The flood was really trying to cleanse the earth, if you think about it, and giving man a fresh start. Have you thought about it that way? That's really what He's doing. He's really cleansing, trying to cleanse evil out of the world and giving man a fresh start. That's long-suffering. So we all talk about the flood, rightfully so. It's a huge event. By the way, this picture up here is in the British Museum. This is a part of the Babylonian Chronicles, which details the flood. This was a difficult find back in the 1800s for people that didn't think the flood actually occurred, and then they find this recorded history that it did occur. So at least it's recorded here as having occurred, and that was difficult for people to accept. Well, but that's the situation that it had gotten into. Yes, Richard. Okay.
You know, the earth was broken up. The water of the deep arose. They just found here lately there's a bunch of water underneath the sea. And so that's where the water was coming from.
Yeah.
Broken up.
Yeah, it did. It both came from the skies and came from underneath as well. So it's a combination of both that flooded. Yes.
We study this for our learning, and like you said, we don't know where we came from unless we know what our past is. And God created everything in His image, and God is good, and everything He created was good. But there is an element within the world in which is called evil, and it comes to us in many forms. It creates fear, it creates anger, it creates hatred, and that's why Cain slew Abel. And God got angry about the way mankind had started to turn, and he destroyed with the flood. And God does not want us to perish. He wants us to be righteous and like him, and to be kind to others. Adam and Eve was the original mama and papa, and every human being on the face of the earth, whether you like to believe it or not believe it, are a part of your flesh, a part of your being, and we need to be mindful of that and treat other humans in the form in which God said, love me and love others.
Yes, yes, that's it. So I think that, so there's a flood, and the flood comes. I have one little, you can take this as an assignment. I find it interesting, so it's just interesting to me, but it's a little novelty. Methuselah was Noah's grandfather. If you look at the years between when Methuselah was born and how long he lived, Noah's father, Lamech, died before his father did. So he had died at the time of the flood. But Methuselah, at 969 years, would have actually been the year of the flood. So I've often wondered if he was faithful or if he got caught in the flood. No reason to know, but it just struck me as an interesting thing. But it led me to something that I thought about. His father and grandfather listened to him preach for 100 years while he built the ark. And I wonder what they thought of Noah. We'll never know unless maybe in heaven somebody tells us that. But I just found it interesting. I found that as a novelty in reading the generations. But all right, so I'm sorry. Let me back here. So God then, after the flood, you know the story. God created a covenant. What was this covenant? He said he's not going to destroy the world again by water. He's saying that there won't be another flood that destroys the world. So I don't know how the world may be destroyed. Well, we know it's going to be done by fire, it said. But he's saying they won't be doing it. It won't be destroyed anymore by the flood waters like this. And he created a covenant. And what was the sign of his covenant? A rainbow, right? He says he set a bow out, and that the rainbow, that's his, I'm in chapter 9, verse 13 now. Verse 11 says he set a covenant. I will establish my covenant with you, neither shall all flesh be cut off any more by the waters of the flood, neither shall there be any more of flood to destroy the earth. And he goes down to verse 13, he says, I do set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a token of the covenant between me and the earth. So when the earth gets destroyed, how the earth gets destroyed in the future, we know that it's going to be consumed with fire, but I don't know that destroys mankind, but that's going to destroy the earth and its elements. But what we know is it won't be destroyed by a flood. That's the covenant, and we get to see that covenant. We just saw one last Sunday. I saw a rainbow, I think, here when I left last Sunday. So, yes.
That's something. The rainbow is a beautiful thing. Mm-hmm. And who took it over?
Yeah. Mankind can take even a covenant of God and turn it into something that would do, that supports something God wouldn't even support. So, anyway, so that's the case, and then so that's what occurs. God's covenant. Then the last thing in this series in the life of Noah is the Tower of Babel at the beginning, when man, now shortly removed from the time of the flood, decided that they wanted to build a tower that reached into the heavens, and at that point everybody spoke one language. Everybody spoke one language, and then after that Tower of Babel, languages were confused to disrupt man from doing what it was trying to do. And I don't know all the details and can't talk about all the details. That's a short amount of time that's covered there in chapter 11, but that resulted in the languages being confounded. And from that point forward, there's some generations there just to show that the world was being replenished by Noah's sons. And that was the commandment that he gave them to do that. So that's the period of the flood and the time right after the flood. Take away from this is God was grieved that he made man. He decided to give man a fresh start by destroying all those that weren't faithful to him. He gave that, and he made a covenant that he would never destroy the world that way again. And he set a rainbow in the clouds. Before even Noah's sons passed away, they tried to do something that God didn't approve of. And as a result of that, he confounded the languages and went to multiple languages, spread the three sons out in different parts of the world, And that was the end result of the time of the flood. Yes, Richard?
They were trying to build a tower up to heaven.
Yes. No, they couldn't have done it anyway. But I think it was the intent that God was disappointed with. If we want to talk about it, I think it was. So knowing the flood has passed now, and we're now into the life of Abraham. And we move over to Genesis chapter 12 when Abraham was born. I think the important part is to pick up is actually right at the beginning. In chapter 12, the first 3 verses, and I think we should read this. Now the Lord had said unto Abram, at that time his name was Abram, get out of your country, from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, into a land that I'll show thee. So he tells Abram to leave. We talk about that all the time. He says, and I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. I'll bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curse thee, and in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. So this is the start of a chosen people. So God's telling Abraham that through him, all nations are going to be blessed. And he gave him some rights that through that. Here's what I think we need to understand. There are other people in the world at that time as well, not just of Abraham. And some of those people continue to worship in a way that God had designed, apparently, because there's a very famous person that was not of the lineage of Abraham in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, that we read about. Cornelius. So Cornelius wasn't Jewish, so he didn't come from Abraham. But he said he offered alms, engaged in prayer. And God says to Peter, you got to go talk to Cornelius because he's a good man, but he's not done what he needs to do since Christ died on the cross. And you need to correct that. And so we know that there's other people. So we need to understand that what he's saying is that they're going to be blessed through Abraham. Well, how are you going to be blessed through Abraham? It's the lineage of Christ. Christ comes through Abraham. We can talk about all the ways you can be blessed through Abraham, but the bottom line is we're blessed through Abraham because Christ came through the lineage of Abraham. That's why it's important in Matthew chapter 1 and Luke chapter 3 to show the lineage of Christ. Because we want to establish the fact to the Jews that, listen, particularly in Matthew, Luke is more driven toward Gentiles, but in the book of Matthew, he goes through to tell the Jews, this Christ that gets crucified, this Christ you're seeing now is from Abraham. And it's this person that the world is going to be blessed through. So we don't need to overstate what the promise of a chosen people is. There's some things that go along with him being a chosen people, but the significant thing is that Christ came through the lineage of Abraham, and that's how we're blessed. The next couple of chapters, 13 and 14, are about Abraham and Lot. And Abraham and Lot met. They both were wealthy, so which is another thing that sometimes gets misinterpreted. Sometimes we think about Abraham and his family as being these nomads that live in tents out in, that's kind of the view sometimes people get, but that was not the case. They had some degree of sophistication. They both had acquired wealth. They both had been successful in what they were doing at that time. In their particular time, this talks about the fact that they both had been so successful, what? They couldn't live together anymore. There wasn't enough supply from the earth to satisfy the flocks that they had. So they decided that they got to divide the land up, and Lot goes one way and Abraham goes the other way. So you know that, and we'll get back to that in just a second, but you know that occurred. That's what occurs in 13 and 14, and that's only just telling you that so that you understand. But it gives you a different picture that sometimes you think about the picture that the world wants to convey of what these people were like. So Abraham had been promised a blessing of a great nation, and he was impatient. And so what did he and Sarah try to do? They tried to do God's work. Sometimes we get impatient, don't we? Sometimes we get impatient. Sometimes we try to rationalize that God really didn't mean it the way he said it. We got a better way to get there. So Sarah and Abraham decide they're going to help God out to get this blessing occurring. And what happened? Somebody knows what happened. What did they do? What did Sarah do? Okay, yeah, I see people whispering it. Sarah gave her handmaiden to Abraham to have a child because Sarah was barren and couldn't have children, and gave a handmaiden, and as a result of that handmaiden, a child was born, Ishmael. So Hagar was the handmaiden that was given to Abraham to try. And this is my own terminology. It's not what it says in the Bible that they were trying to do God's work, but that's the only way I can read it. Well, God said He was going to bless, but it hasn't happened, and Sarah's barren, and we're getting old, and there can't be a child from God. I mean, He did create the world, He did cause a flood, but I don't think He can cause this to happen. So we're going to help him. I'm going to give him Hagar, and Hagar is going to have a child, and it happened to be a son, Ishmael. And so, we've helped God, but God said that wasn't what His plan was. It wasn't what His plan was. His plan was it was going to come through Sarah. That's what He said. And ultimately, that's where Isaac comes from. I think Genesis chapter 16 is important because I don't think sometimes that we realize what happens here in this. And I'm going to go through these next few verses kind of quickly. Because what happens is there's a second great nation that comes out of Abraham. And we don't think about that sometimes. But there was a second great nation. There was one where everybody was going to be blessed, but there was a second nation that also God said was going to come out of Abraham. And this is what it is. Let's just quickly go through these verses. 16 verse 12. So verse 11 just says he's going to bear a son. His name's going to be Ishmael. He'll be a wild man. His hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him. And he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. So that's giving you some idea of what it's going to be like. And then 17 and verse 20, it says, and as for Ishmael, so Ishmael goes out, Hagar goes out. Sarah gets mad. Let me tell you, as you know the story, Sarah gets mad when Ishmael is born to Hagar. She said he wants to throw Hagar out. She goes out with Ishmael. Ishmael thinks he's going to die, and so he's under a tree. She goes away. She prays, and God says, well, wait a minute, I hear that. In verse 20 it says, as for Ishmael, I've heard thee. Behold, I have blessed him, and will make him fruitful, and will multiply him exceedingly. 12 princes shall he beget, and I will make him what? A great nation. You talk about Abraham and the great nation that comes from Abraham through Isaac, which is of the lineage of Christ. But he also said Ishmael is going to be a great nation. Ishmael, well, let's just jump ahead to 25. We'll have to come back to some verses. But 25 and verse 9, I just want to point out that Ishmael had a better relationship with Abraham than what we want to talk about. In verse 9, his son, 25 verse 9, his sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of, I can't pronounce it, in the field of Ephraim, the son of Zohar, the Hittite, which is before. So they came back together and buried Abraham. But Ishmael then ended up going into Arabia. He settled in Arabia, and as a result of that, he started the Arab nations. Now, some people don't like to say that, but that's in essence what happened. And it became a great nation. Islam, some people would say, came from Ishmael. And even, in fact, most Islams, and I'm not going to go into full discussion of Islam, but most Islams, people would acknowledge that Ishmael was the first of the prophets. While they would say that their religion actually started in 570 BC, roughly that time frame, through the prophet Muhammad, but they acknowledge Ishmael as a prophet. Another great nation in size, I'm saying. We often, sometimes we look at what happened with Abraham and Isaac as we should, and that's the emphasis of this. I mean, the Bible's not written to give us historical context. It's not written to give us history, per se. It's not written to give us history. It's written to show why Christ is a fulfillment of God's eternal purpose. That's why it's written, and how we should live as a result of that, how the church was established as a result of that. That's why it's written here. So it's not written to give all those other details, but it is important to pick up the fact that God did say there would be two nations that come from the loins of Abraham. Both of them were great. One of them, a blessing. Following that, the next two chapters, Genesis 18 and 19, are Sodom and Gomorrah being destroyed for sin. And then we move to the life of Isaac. Isaac was sandwiched in between two important people, Abraham and Jacob. So he had a very prominent father and a very prominent son. And the life of Isaac's covered there in those verses. Abraham confirms his faith. That's the way that I like to think about it. We always say he was willing to sacrifice Isaac. I think he was willing to sacrifice Isaac, obviously, in Genesis chapter 22, but he was just confirming his faith. That's what he was doing. He was confirming his faith in God. He knew that God would provide. He didn't know if Isaac would be killed or sacrificed and another son would come to him, or if some other thing would occur, but he trusted in God. Abraham then seeks yes, Andy. Yeah, could be that too. Josephus, yeah. I think that, yeah. I don't know which of the things that was on Abraham's mind. We have no way of knowing that. But what we know is that he had confidence enough in God that if he in fact killed Isaac, that God would fulfill his obligation. Maybe he learned his lesson through Hagar. I don't know. But that's chapter 22. Chapter 23 and 24, he seeks a wife for Isaac, and it's a long chapter. 24 particularly is a long chapter, pretty long chapter, I think. And you should read that. Sometimes there's a lot of parallels between Abraham and Sarah's life and Isaac and Rebekah's life. So he goes and gets Rebekah. He wants someone from his countrymen to be Isaac's wife. So he sends a servant there. Rebekah comes back, lives with Isaac. And they've got a lot of similarities between the lives of the two of them. She was barren also at the beginning as well. But Rebekah gives two children, Jacob and Esau. Genesis 25 through 28 is a discussion of Jacob and Esau. In Genesis 33, I put in. I'm not going to actually read through any of those, but Genesis 25 through 28, you can see the life of Esau and Jacob. Jacob had aspirations, obviously, and Esau had different aspirations. And they were twins. Jacob and Esau were twins. And Esau came out first. And we can talk about how that, if you want to, or you can read about it. But ultimately, what happened is that Esau, even though he was the firstborn, which gave him a lot of rights under Jewish tradition, laws, heritage, but he didn't get those rights, even though he was firstborn. Because there's two major things that came with that situation. The two major things that came with that is he got more of the inheritance, a birthright, and he got a blessing to be the leader of the nation. So that was what should have happened for Esau. But it's not what happened with Esau. Esau comes back from hunting and he's hungry. And Jacob's fixed some food. And Esau says, I'm hungry. And Jacob, being wise or deceitful or conniving, you pick your terms. And I can tell this is not going to work this way. Being conniving, he says that... For that, he says, okay, if you'll give me your birthright, I'll give you some food. And Esau said, well, if I'm going to die anyway, what good's a birthright? He probably wasn't going to die, but that was his view. So you go back and think about what people took or what they were willing to give up. For a meal, he gave up his birthright, which was a doubling of his inheritance over his brother. So now Esau's lost his birthright. And then the second thing, which was definitely trickery, his blessing. So Isaac, when he's old and he can't see, Isaac asks his son to go out, Esau, his oldest son, to go out and prepare him some venison and food for him to eat, and then he's going to give him a blessing. But between Jacob and his mother, they said, well, we can't let that happen. And Jacob then, in fact, goes in, puts something on his arms, to make him feel hairy, because we could go into that, but that was a distinguishing factor, a distinguishing characteristic between Jacob and Esau. Got himself smelling like something. His mother fixing some stew. He takes it in and says to Isaac, and Isaac says, yes, you smell like your brother, but you don't speak like him. And so come over here. And he rubbed his arm and he felt the hair. He could smell the venison on him. And so he said, well, you must be Esau. How did you get back here so quick? And Jacob's response was, well, the Lord provided it for me. And he did, I guess, through his mother. And so Isaac blessed Jacob. So now Jacob has Esau's birthright and he has his blessing. Esau comes back, just 1 second, Richard. Esau comes back in. He brings in the venison. Isaac trembles because he can't believe what's happened. Esau says, but you can, basically just bless me, forget what happened. And Isaac said, I can't do that. There's no do-over. That's a good one. There's no do-over. And you will serve your younger brother. Last comment, go ahead.
Once they give the blessing, I don't understand that, but they can't take it back.
Yeah, they can't take it back. So it was done. The deed was done. So Jacob and Esau now, and then Jacob later on, so that's Genesis 25 through 28. Jacob later on goes in to get his wife from his countryman. He actually takes a wife that's the daughter of his mother's brother. I believe that's correct, his mother's brother. And he comes back, and when he's coming back, he's going to meet Esau, and he's really concerned about that meeting. And this is in chapter 33, so you can jump ahead and read that if you want to. But he's concerned about that meeting, and the reason he's concerned about that meeting is he thinks Esau is going to kill him. And some of you may recall that he struggles with God, and he has a dream, and that occurs during this time as he's anxious for this meeting. Yet Esau welcomes him, and they get welcomed. Now, later in life, way past Jacob and Esau, the Edomites, which are the tribe of Esau, they come into conflict and they never get along. And Edomites actually wasn't good to Israel. But that was the generations in the future. Esau and Jacob, it didn't occur. So with that, I'm not going to try to go into the story of Jacob and his wives and his 12 sons and the life of Joseph. I think we can cover that pretty quickly. I think Joseph may be the most studied character actually in the book of Genesis. Actually, it's got the most information devoted to him, oddly enough. 13 chapters devoted to the life of Joseph. But with that, can we, is there any other questions or comments? Because I think the bell is about to ring and I don't want to try to start the next section. Yes?
I can just speak up. There's no wonder that there's so much bitterness and hatred in the world today, particularly between God's chosen people and also those of Ishmael. And it's been that way forever, and it's going to be that way forever. We see it in the news today.
Yeah, this is it's a difficult and a topic that requires a lot of attention besides this. The only comment I want to make is this. So, and this isn't a political statement, it isn't an indication. I think it's a biblical statement. So the biblical statement is this. Truly, the Abraham and Israel were to be a blessed nation. That's true. But they don't have a special spot with God right now. That special spot with God right now is with who? It's with the church. It's with the church. And we can't lose sight of the fact that what the Jews were told in the New Testament over and over again is that Christ and his church, which was decided from the very beginning, is where God's blessed people rest today. That's where God's blessed people rest today. That's what we need to stay focused on. That's what you want to be a part of if you want to benefit from God's will. Now, There's a whole bunch of other things we could talk from political, historical environment around that, but I just want you to understand that what Abraham was blessed for was what? A lineage that delivered us whom? Christ. How are all nations blessed? Remember, all nations were going to be blessed through Abraham, not just one nation. All nations were going to be blessed through Abraham because what? Christ came through that lineage. The church was established in His name that He bought with His blood, which is what we want to be a part of. That's how you're blessed through Abraham. Because if you had to be Jewish to be blessed through Abraham, I would guess most of us in here would not be blessed. But God had a different plan. In Ephesians in chapter 3, He says there's a different plan. It was a mystery. It's no longer a mystery. The gospel is open to all, which we're a part of. So thanks for the comment, and I appreciate the attention in class. I'm going to have to try to figure out how to speed this up in the future. So thank you.